So thank you so much, Volker, for the kind invitation and introduction. It's really nice to be here and start to kick off the day with a session on central bank independence, theoretical foundations and empirical evidence. We have two excellent European scholars on monetary economics here with us today, Gerhard Illing, Professor Emeritus at LMU Munich, Ludwig Maximilians University Munich, previously held chairs here in Frankfurt and Bamberg. Got his PhD in economics also in Munich and a Master of Philosophy from the University of Cambridge. He's an influential German macroeconomist, not least since generations of students here in Germany have been introduced to the subject through the book Makroökonomie by Olivier Blanchard, of which he co-authored the German edition. So when I was a student many years ago, I also learned about macroeconomics from his book. He has done prior work on central bank independence, and he pointed out that the legal independence does not automatically translate into credibility in practice. You need to earn your reputation as an independent central banker. And before the ECB started its work in the late 90s, Gerhard warned of a reputation trap. He argued that the new independent central bank might over-signal toughness early on, and so risking to be overly restrictive to build credibility. And we're very much looking forward to hearing his thoughts today on central bank independence, economic theory, and central bank independence. Gerhard.
Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction. And let me thank in particular the organizers and in particular Volker Wieland for inviting me to this fantastic and stimulating conference. So yesterday, Ottmar Issing already emphasized that central bank independence is the bedrock for its credibility and its efficiency. And there in history, both in past history but also in recent history, you find quite a lot of cases where the lack of central bank independence puts pressure, political pressure, and quite often it leads to disastrous outcomes with high inflation and stagnation. Sylvester will present you detailed econometric evidence about the role of central bank independence, but Volker assigned to me the task to talk about economic theory and independence, and I want to convince you that game theory can help a lot to understand all these issues, all these crucial issues. The workhorse model, is it, do you understand me or, yeah, is it okay? The workhorse model is the Barrow-Gordon model. It's more than 40 years old now, and it's based on seminal work by Finn Critland and Ed Prescott on dynamic inconsistency. The starting point of the Barrow-Gordon model is the short-term Phillips curve, which introduces a trade-off between stabilization of inflation at the target rate, pi star, we discussed yesterday whether it should be 0, 2% or simply low, and stabilizing output. And whenever there is structural inefficiency in the economy, for the policy maker, there's an incentive to raise inflation above the target in order to stimulate output. So the promise to stick to the target is not credible, it's not dynamically consistent, or in a game theoretic language from Reinhard Selten, it's not sub-game perfect. Private agents, of course, anticipate this incentive, and they form high expected rate of inflation, and this high expected rate of inflation makes it costly to implement stability. And in the end, we end up at a too high inflation rate, but no gain in output. So this Barrow-Gordon model stresses the role of binding rules of commitment. Now, we know that commitment is important. Already nearly 3,000 years ago, Homer in the Odyssey gave a good example that Ulysses asked his sailing crew to tie himself to the mast in order to prevent him from giving in to the temptations of the songs of the Syrians. Alan Blinder from Princeton University, who was also vice chair at the Fed mid of the 90s, he made this nice statement that during all the time he was working at the Fed, he never met any colleague who was subject to the pressure to raise the rate of inflation. So obviously the design of the Fed at that time already helped to get around this bias. And I think game theoretic insights about the role of independence and the role of commitment can help to understand quite a few issues central banks are facing. And I want to convince you that there is a value added using game theory. I will talk about four issues. First, the Phillips curve, as in the Barrow-Gordon model, the inflation bias. And the inflation bias is a problem even if there's no political pressure, if we are in a structurally inefficient economy. Then, using the same tools, you can also analyze what is the optimal strategy if interest rates hit the lower bound. Former days it was called the zero lower bound, now the effective lower bound. And interesting, then we get just the kind of opposite result. We get a deflation bias. And then, of course, with game theoretic tools, you can also analyze the strategic incentives between fiscal and monetary agents and stress the importance of monetary dominance relative to fiscal dominance in order not to give in to the pressure to inflate public debt away, a topic which becomes now again quite topical. It was for a long time, I think, people were quite reluctant about that. And finally, an issue which I got interested in when I was here in Frankfurt from 95 to 2001. At that time, there were already quite a few crises, so the LTCM crisis in particular and the Asian crisis. And then I got interested in the question, how should central banks act when there is a systemic crisis? Should they play a role of lender of last resort? But again, here the problem of dynamic consistency is kind of crucial. In a systemic crisis, the risk of bank runs, of contagion and panics is likely to impose enormous costs to the economy. So this calls for provision of unlimited liquidity. But providing liquidity, of course, knowing that the banks will act before or more risky, they will encourage in risky activities and possibly gamble for resurrection. So these are the issues I want to talk about if time allows. Otherwise, I will skip some of the aspects. So the Barrow-Gordon model analyzes the interaction between the policymaker and private agents. And the easiest way, the simplest way to model is to use a three-stage game. In stage one, the policymaker announces some policy, the rate of inflation, depending on the shocks, let it be supply shocks, demand shocks, or markup shocks. Or you can also reframe it in a time of, in a sense of an interest rate rule, a Taylor rule. In stage two, private agents form their price expectations, their inflation expectations. Then the shocks happen, and then the central bank acts. And the key point of Barrow-Gordon is that to promise on average price stability, so leave the inflation rate on average at the target rate, is not subgame perfect. Due to structural inefficiencies, there's always an incentive for the policymaker, even a policymaker who wants to maximize social welfare, to stimulate in stage 3, raise the inflation above target. And the intuition is that the trade-off for the central banker changes once the private agents have formed their expected inflation, once they have set their wages, their prices, and the bond prices. So it's not rational to trust such promises. Now, it's easy in an economy without shocks to get around that by just simply tie the central bank to implement the target rate pi star, independent of whatever happens. But, of course, this also has costs. A mechanic rule, strict inflation targeting, or inflation nutter, as Mervyn King called it, prevents the central bank from responding to shocks, and usually this will be costly because the flexibility to react to shocks is also one of the key features of central banking. So what is the optimal mechanism? How should we design the rule of the game to implement commitment? Well, Emanuel had this nice quote, actually I didn't remember that, but surprising, that you have to earn credibility, of course, that's a real challenge. But in principle, at least you can model that as a principal agent problem. We talked about that already yesterday, and the way we do it is we look at heterogeneous agents. Each agent has some preference, relative preference to price stability relative to stabilizing output, which I designed by the Greek letter theta, theta I. And so agents are risk averse, so they prefer to dampen both price and output fluctuations. Now, in a democracy, some kind of government will be elected, and according to public choice, this is the medium voter with preference theta m. And then what our models tell is that the government should delegate policy to an independent central bank with some weight theta central bank, theta CB, and I will derive the optimality condition on the next slide. But the general insight is that monetary policy should be delegated to an independent agent, and in principle, not goal independence is important, but instrument independence. So the central bank should use any instrument it considers to be required, helpful to implement its job. And in that context, accountability in the sense as Ottmar Issing yesterday talked about, I mean, there are different ideas of accountability as came out yesterday. Accountability by transparency, full communication to the public or to the government, to the median voter is key. The most popular mechanism is Ken Rogoff's delegation to a conservative central banker. I will derive that on the next slide, but I will also briefly talk about a different result by Karl Walsh. He applied mechanism design ideas to characterize some optimal central bank contract, and he showed that it mimics the flexible inflation targeting. So this kind of alludes to the institutional arrangement in New Zealand or the Bank of England. Now let's focus on Rogoff's key arguments, because they are so central for this understanding of independence and delegation of the policy task to a central banker. Rogoff analyzed the trade-off between inflation bias and stabilization bias. And he analyzed if the representative median voter, theta m, delegates policy to some other agent, what agent should he pick? And so there are many different agents in the economy with relative weight of price stability relative to output stability. The lower the weight of price stability, the higher will be the inflation bias. And the larger the weight on price stability, the lower will be the inflation bias, but at the same time, the higher will be the variance of the shocks because the dampening of the shocks is then reduced. And now what you do is, as game theorists, you minimize expected losses from the point of view of the government, this weight theta m, by picking some central banker with weight theta cb, knowing that how he will respond to the shocks. And here, in particular, markup shocks and supply shocks are important. And this gives us a nice implicit function. So it's kind of easy to characterize that the central bank weight should be larger than the median voter weight, and it should be larger the structural inefficiency, which I capture by the Greek parameter delta, and the smaller the variance of the shock. Intuitively, this is fairly evident. If there are no shocks, then strict inflation targeting is optimal. But if shocks play a large role, in particular supply shocks or markup shocks, then an inflation nutter with infinite weight to price stability would not be optimal. So this stresses the need for credible rules, and the suggestion of Rogoff was to delegate monetary policy to a conservative central banker. But these rules should not be mechanical. Now, as I said, Karl Walsh applied mechanism design, the theory of optimal contracts, to the question, what would be an optimal central bank contract, mid of the 90s. And he showed that this mimics flexible inflation targeting, which allows flexible response to real shocks and avoids the inflation bias. And so this kind of gives the support for the arrangements in New Zealand or the Bank of England. Rogoff is, of course, the key role model for the Bundesbank and later on for the ECB. Well, whatever institutional arrangement we had in different countries, during the last, let's say at least 40 years, starting from the end of the 80s, we observed an impressive decline in the rate of inflation. So there was a tendency to low and stable inflation, and at the same time to low macroeconomic volatility. So in the end, I think this was extremely successful. It was called the Great Moderation, and mid of the 2005 or so, many economists had the view that we solved all problems, all troubles, and there's nothing to worry about. But then the financial crisis came, 2007, 2008, and then all these old challenges which central bankers had to face before, they came back very strongly. So during the financial crisis, central banks had to act as lender of last resort. And they lowered interest rates, and immediately, pretty soon, they hit the lower bound. That's the risk of deflation bias. And then, of course, after the financial crisis, and in particular after the pandemic, public debt in many countries has increased dramatically and is still in many countries on upward trajectory. Now, let me come to the, 5 minutes, to the zero lower bound.
I should have applied this rule yesterday.
I think perhaps I focus on that because this is a wonderful example how game theory or economic theory or macroeconomic theory can help to frame actual policy. So many macroeconomists and game theorists were interested in this zero lower bound already a long time before the central banks here in Europe and in the US were facing that constraint. And one of the seminal papers is Egerton-Woodford. They analyzed the optimal control policy at the effective lower bound. And the intuition behind, I mean, that's all I can present here, is that in this case, it's optimal to commit to overshoot the target later when the economy is back to normal already. The intuition is that this helps to induce long-run inflationary expectations, and this lowers the effective real rate today. Now, how can we convince market participants that short-term rates will stay low for longer? We again face a credibility problem. Once the economy is back to normal, the central bank will pursue the optimal policy, and they have no incentive to stick to the promise. So again, the policy is not time consistent. What kind of commitment mechanism can we use? And the suggestion of Egerton-Woodford and many others was to use forward guidance. Now, Ottmar Issing, 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, had this nice statement that forward guidance suffers from exactly the same credibility problem it's meant to solve. So it can be just cheap talk to announce that. And that's, I think, in my view at least, is one of the key reasons why quantitative easing was used as a kind of commitment mechanism. Let me just show the success of this strategy, success in quotation mark. I think many of you will see it as complete failure, but we can have a discussion about that with respect to the ECB. The Fed did exactly the same, so that a couple of months before. In their revision of monetary policy strategy 21, the ECB committed that in the case of the effective lower bound, it will avoid premature tightening, and it made this forward guidance announcement that interest rates will normalize only after net purchases have been ended. And they made also the statement that this may imply a transitory period where inflation is moderately above the target. The purpose is, of course, to send the markets the signal that there will be a steady recovery. And now the challenge is the exit strategy, and many here in the room will say the ECB and also the Fed failed miserably. So we can discuss, was the commitment to stall? Should central banks commit to such a policy if there's high uncertainty without clear escape clauses? And in an interview with the FT, lunch with the FT, Christine Lagarde made this nice statement. What we should have learned is that we can't just rely on textbook cases. I have a nice textbook. But central banks shouldn't and pure models, we have to think with a broader horizon. But I want to kind of defend this game theoretic message. First of all, by pointing out that the key reason for this high period of inflation was the underestimation of the persistence of the energy price shocks after the Ukrainian war. So it's easy to show that all underestimated that, in particular, of course, the central banks, but also private forecasters. And then at that time, many predicted or warned that we come back to the scenario of stagflation like in the 70s, which was base of the Barrow-Gordon model. But obviously, the credibility of central banks helped to prevent the comeback of this period. So, okay. Now, well, monetary versus fiscal dominance, I think you are all familiar with the importance of monetary dominance. So the policy design recommended is delegate price stability to an independent central bank, assign fiscal policy to the Treasury, and in particular tell the Treasury that the Treasury should aim to achieve debt sustainability by an appropriate path of government spending and taxation. But things are not so easy because you can't bind, I mean, it's hard to bind policymakers from now on till all the future. I mean, what happens, what determines the price level is not just the current monetary policy, the current kind of printing of money or whatever, but it all depends on the expectations in the future. And so, and this makes it really challenging, and if capital markets expect that there will be a switch, this will be extremely costly. Sergeant Wallace, in a famous paper 50 years ago, called this a chicken game between the fiscal age and central bank, and they argue that central banks are the chickens. But I think history later on proved that this is not necessarily the case. So changes in the mechanism design, which happened at that time, in particular also the emphasis on independence, helped to make sure that fiscal policy's job is to satisfy the intertemporal budget constraint. And one of the impressive examples is Brazil. Okay, so now here just in Brazil, in the 80s, there has been high rates of inflation, kind of in together with the increase in debt, but later on the inflation rate is much lower. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I have to
Gerhard.
wait. I have to wait.
Yes, we try to turn this on. Thank you so much, Gerhard. I was appointed a conservative session chair, so I wanted to honor that appointment. And we want to have, of course, some time for discussion. But before we open the floor for questions, we would have liked to see the second presentation for today. We have another great European scholar of monetary economics here, Sylvester Eijffinger, the Jean Monnet Professor of European Financial and Monetary Integration at Tilburg University. Previously held roles at College of Europe and Humboldt University Berlin, where we overlapped but never met when I was a student. You were teaching there, but unfortunately... Yes.
Very conservative.
Very conservative. He's also been a long-term visiting professor at Harvard University and a member of the monetary experts panel for the monetary dialogue of the European Parliament with the ECB president, one of the accountability measures here in Europe. That Volker and we also contribute to this now. He's 15 years, okay.
3 terms.
Very impressive. So, leading scholar on monetary governance and central banking. In his prior work, Sylvester emphasized that durable independence is strengthened by accountability and transparency. Central banks need clear objectives. They need to explain their actions, and there need to be, of course, institutional checks. Much of his work empirically related central bank communication and transparency to the expectation formation process. So we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, the chairman is very strict because he wants to compensate for yesterday. Yesterday there was some leeway in time, but yeah, because of the breaks. Volker, because and I don't discuss with chairman, never do. When I'm chairman, I'm very strict. I could even control Alex Koekeman, and that's quite a challenge. Yeah? But anyhow, my dear friend who passed away, I have written together with my co-author Jacob de Haan. We wrote 30 years ago our Princeton essay on the political economy of central bank independence. And that was, well, refereed by 2 eminent scholars, Peter Cannon and Ken Rogoff. And that was quite a challenge because we had 4 or 5 versions. And I see Andreas Hofer, who did an update of our study in Krediet und Kapitaal in 2023. Very nice study. And Jacob and I decided to have a new way of... is there something? Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. But you know the slides, Gerhard? Yeah, you know the slides. But anyhow, so we decided to not do a simple update, but to look to the literature in the past 30 years in terms of new indices, in terms of relations according to the relation with inflation, and also to look to new research on political pressure. We thank President Trump for that. He evoked a complete new literature on political pressure. Very interesting papers like by political economists, political scientists. And actually, this is a very new brand of literature, so we also took that into consideration. So we worked quite hard the last couple of weeks to make that. And of course, comments are very welcome, and because we want to make a CPR discussion paper, or CES-EVO paper, whatever. And also IMFS paper.
We can have multiple.
Yeah, that's up to you. That's up to you. That's up to you. So I do this very quickly because Gerhard gave already excellent presentation on the theory. Well, we know this literature very good. But there is one thing I want to add to this discussion, and that was a confusion yesterday. And I want to clarify that. Everybody spoke about conservative central banker, a la Rogov, and independent central banker, as if they are equal. That's not the case. Let me explain. Without any equations, just verbally. Conservative central banker, conservative means additional weight on inflation stabilization vis-à-vis output stabilization in the central bank loss function. You compare that with the social loss function, and then you have a combination of the central bank loss function and the social loss function in the monetary policy reaction function, where you see the independence of the central bank. That can be zero, completely dependent, People's Bank of China or whatever, or one, you may say the Bundesbank, the good old Bundesbank, and then you see there's a difference in influence. It is related to instrument independence, not so much goal independence. That's another discussion point. Do you include also goal independence? It's about instrument independence. And then if you combine that, and we did that theoretically, both for a new classical framework, Lucas supply function, but a new Keynesian framework, that's with an inflation expectations augmented Phillips curve in the Oxford Economic Papers and European Journal of Politics, you can show it's the product that matters. Gamma, conservativeness, epsilon, we call that independence. It's the product which matters. So if you are more independent as a central bank, you can afford to be less conservative. And if you are less independent, you have to be conservative, because the product is determining the equilibrium inflation rate in the product. Actually, Ken Rogoff, that's a small remark, made his wonderful contribution in '85, but he had no closed form solution, because he needed envelope theory to prove that. That's very interesting. It's very difficult to prove that. And if you include the political pressure literature, theoretically, it's even harder, because political pressure is depending on inflation and output. It becomes very hard. But we showed in those two papers for two different kind of models that it's very important about the product. And why could the Bundesbank be sometimes very relaxed with monetary targeting? Simply because they were believed. Independence gives you more leeway in terms of being less conservative. Very important point. Maybe somebody can transfer this message to President Trump. Would be nice. Okay. Well, I'm naughty. As a professor, a little bit naughty. You should be. Then about mandates, well, I won't elaborate too much on that because of the sake of time, but we're living in different times, as Otmar rightfully said yesterday. That means that we have a different environment. We have a European Central Bank dealing with many countries and many politicians. Actually, the one person, one vote principle was done because of the expertise. Otmar was right. And if you appoint only former ministers of finance, well, they have some expertise, but not particularly in monetary policy. I would say more in fiscal policy. So that's something which undermines the one person, one vote principle. And we don't have the overlaps of different states, like in the US, Feds. That's Federal Reserve banks are overlapping, that makes it easier. So that's really a problem. The mandates were also expanded. So we had, I was 15 years in the monetary experts panel. I wrote those papers about the European Banking Union. The first advices to the monetary dialogue. Every quarter we had to write a briefing. So I wrote 60 briefing papers. Not that I had so much influence, to be honest. With Charles Wiplos, we were the longest serving members of the monetary experts panel. But anyhow, we tried to do our best. But you see the expansion of the mandate to also financial stability issues. Also, and I don't speak about green deals and diversity and other things, but makes it more complicated because there are trade-offs between monetary stability and financial stability. The institute is called Monetary and Financial Stability. Yeah? Very rightful. Very good name. Why? Because it's both. And sometimes, not only in the short run, but also in the long run, there are possible conflicts between monetary stability and financial stability, macroprudential supervision. So I would do it quickly. So what we do is three things. One, examine the new indicators, CBI, new Romelli, Garriga. Andreas Heuver and Catherine Janke did also some extension of the Kuckerman index with quantitative easing. So we go to every. There's one person who also made some contribution but didn't share his data. That's Thomas Adrian, but that's up to him. If you don't share the data with us, we won't include you in the table. Very simple. And then we look to the relationship between CBI and inflation, political influence, and discuss accountability, because we were also writing a lot of pieces on accountability. So the discussion yesterday on accountability was a déjà vu for me, because we Europeans read always the American journals. But do the Americans read the European journals? No, 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 no. That's a problem, because sometimes there are also interesting things in the European journals. And the CPR discussion papers, anyhow. But anyhow, so what we do is, I will do this right away, main findings. So we look to the Kuckerman. I think Kuckerman index is the most elaborated index and had to be updated. Well, Andreas and Catherine did that in Krediet und Kapitaal in 2023, and also extended that with quantitative easing. Very interesting. Quantitative easing is not only about credit lines for governments, but has also to do with inflation, low inflation, negative interest rates. So we have maybe also negative time, Mr. Chairman. That would also be interesting. But anyhow, so we look to that, and we look to the rule of law. The rule of law. I wrote in 2003 a paper which I presented at the Harvard University Economics Department, Monetary Policy and the Rule of Law. And everybody said, is that important? I said, yes, it's quite important. Because, legal independence, what does it mean if there's no rule of law? If you go to the Central African Republic, the law, the central bank law is comparable with the Bundesbank, because that should be the Deutsche Bundesbank. But does it matter? No. Oh, so it's very important, rule of law. Then we look also to the accountability issues, which is not exactly the same as central bank transparency. I made with Peter Gerhard one of the first index on central bank transparency, which is elaborated by Dinsen and Eijffinger, and that's a part of accountability. It's a part of accountability. It's not the whole accountability. Accountability is about prioritization as well of objectives, and we come to that. And Charles was very right. You have to clarify it to keep not only the central banks, but also the financial supervisors accountable. Must be clarified. So here is, well, I won't elaborate the Kuckerman Index. You can read it. There is also a paper. We will elaborate that, 20 pages. Well, if we have the comments by everybody, we will elaborate it and will be published as IMFS discussion paper, CPR discussion paper, whatever. But these are the most important aspects of the Kuckerman Index. I think it's a very nice index. And then here we have, and you take your time, I don't elaborate every index, but you see Romelli. Romelli had updated the Kuckerman Index, non-weighted, the Greeley-Mascandar Tabellini, which is a more narrow index, and then he made his own index. And I have some problems with his own index. Not because it's new, but because it includes also accountability aspects. And you should separate independence from accountability. There are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have an independent central bank without accountability. Yes, indeed. But you have to separate them in terms of definition. It should be very clear-cut in terms of definition. So you cannot make a hybrid index of independence and accountability. Then you have Eijffinger and Janke, who did also the update of the Kuckerman Index, but also with quantitative easing. So it's a very interesting paper, you should read that. And Dinsen and Eijffinger did also an update of central bank independence index of Kuckerman, the non-weighted. And then there's a new one, Cariga, and that's an interesting study because it looks to all kinds of developing countries. So not only OECD countries, Western countries, but also Africa and, all those exotic places where you say, what is the independence? But take care, you can look to the index, but you should also include the rule of law. If there's no rule of law, there's no effective central bank independence. Right? Here we illustrate that in table 1. And then the scores, I already referred to Central African Republic, but here's also the People's Bank of China, a very high score. Well, doesn't mean anything because the Central Committee is, of course, in charge, is a directive system. But for example, in Australia, there are no restrictions on central bank lending, but there is a clear understanding between the Australian government and the Reserve Bank of Australia that we shouldn't do that. So it's sometimes a little bit hybrid, Here we have the correlation matrix. That's important. Why? Because you see, everybody says, oh, well, it's the same. No, it's not the same. Look to that. Yeah, you see clear that it's not always fully covered. So you see 1, 2, 3 asterisk in terms of significance. It's not completely the same, and therefore it's important to use various measures of central bank independence, like you did in your paper, because you can compare, and maybe you have found, because of subjective elements sometimes. So even in the coding of central banks, there's difference. Then we go to the recent empirical evidence. So table 3 summarizes, I'll come to that. Romelli did also interesting work about that. And here you have the table. The table about the correlation between inflation and central bank independence. And now I come to Romelli also mentioned that, but also Alex Kuckerman in his book, and we did as well in our paper. There's sometimes reverse causation. And what do I mean with reverse causation? If there is a very long period of hyperinflation, Weimar Republic. Then, of course, the Americans were also important in the Gesetz über die Deutsche Bundesbank, and Deutsche Länder. But what you do get is that you get more independent central bank. However, in the Gesetz über die Deutsche Bundesbank is not price stability. It's mentioned the Währung zu sichern. That's something different, eh? But anyhow, it was price stability, and you see that sometimes periods of very high inflation or hyperinflation lead to adjustment in the central bank law, and thereby low inflation. So I would say the correlation can be explained in a causal, if you look to a difference between the short term and the long term, the very long term. If there's a long term experience of high inflation, then normally central banks are going to a stricter central bank law in terms of independence. And then, of course, the result be lower inflation. Okay, then I won't elaborate too much on this. So the political interference, political pressure, appointment. Then we go to, I would say, a new brand of literature. This has to do with this political pressure, the political influence central banks. If you want to do it theoretically, then it becomes very complicated, Gerhard, because you have to add to, I would say, the central bank laws function also political pressure, but say, call it delta. The delta, political pressure, is depending on inflation and output, because that's the reason why political pressure is exerted. And then you come in a very complicated equations system, not the Rogov type of equations, because then you have to get a solution where you also integrate that whole political pressure thing. So the whole thing of including political pressure is, well, you can comment on that later, Gerhard. But anyhow, so what is very complicated to make it also theoretically including. Then here we have the political pressure literature. Well, you see that's already a lot, and you see that it started already in 2012. Ansgar Belke and his co-author, also Jacob de Haan. Binder is a very interesting study, published in the Journal of Money, Credit and Banking. And now there's a whole industry, and that's of course, we thank President Trump for that. With this political pressure thing, you see that there's a lot of interest in including political pressure in the decision-making process. Very interesting literature, empirically, theoretically difficult to model that, but very interesting literature. And I think you haven't seen the rest of that. And it has also to do with the central bank law. Is it possible to adjust the central bank law? Let me comment on the Federal Reserve Act. I worked at the Federal Reserve in '92 as well, so I know this discussion, the Humphrey Hawkins testimonies, how influential they are within the Federal Reserve System. And they're always afraid that there is a new amendment. Take the 1977 amendment of the twin objective and the Humphrey Hawkins testimonies. You worked at the Federal Reserve. Yes. I will stick to my 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman. But important is that the Federal Reserve Act, I wrote a piece on that for Project Syndicate last year, can be amended by a simple majority in the House of Representatives and a supermajority in the Senate. A supermajority means the majority plus 6, because you have the filibustering thing. So it is possible. It is possible to adjust the Federal Reserve Act. And I know, when I was at the Federal Reserve, and you worked also at the Federal Reserve, that before, 2 weeks before Humphrey Hawkins, everybody became very nervous. Don Cohn and everybody, Greenspan, what are they going to ask? And of course the question was always, Mr. Chairman, that's Greenspan or his successors, in my constituency is a lot of unemployment, and what are you going to do about it? And of course the answer would be nothing. But that's very difficult to sell, so you had to turn around, and Greenspan was the maestro in that. And I think also Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen did also the best, Jay Powell as well. And what you see, and Otmar referred to the Thomas Becket effect, with one T, not Samuel Beckett, but Thomas Becket, 1132, Chancellor of Henry II, and later on Archbishop of Canterbury. The Thomas Becket effect means that if you appoint a central banker with an independent mandate for a longer term than the political cycle, then in the environment of that central bank becomes more conservative or more independent, or both. Yeah? So there you have a very interesting development, and you see that. Look to Jay Powell. Jay Powell. The Thomas Becket effect is, for me, observable, appointed in the first term by President Trump. What will happen with Kevin Walsh? Also very interesting. I hope also Thomas Becket effect. Yeah? Yeah? But anyhow, we don't know. We have to observe. We don't know ex ante. We will see ex post. So let me come to accountability, and then I'm finished, Mr. Chairman. I want first to start with a very important quote by Ben Bernanke. Broad consensus has emerged about policymakers, etc. And he makes a difference between goal independence and instrument independence. And goal independence is capacity to formulate your policy goal. The ECB had that capacity, and I know this discussion with Otmar, and I know them also the discussion in the European Parliament with the Monetary Experts Panel for the Monetary Dialogue, always the same. What is price stability? Is it 1.7? Is it 1.8? Is it 1.9? Or beyond? So this discussion were eternal, and you know, Otmar was in that beginning period a little bit anxious to formulate that, and I understand, because you shouldn't, this is a little quote of you in the discussion with Willem Duiter, you shouldn't overburden the ECB with too much transparency in the beginning. You said that. And you were right. In that time, new institution had to prove itself, should overburden ECB with too much transparency. But nowadays, I think transparency is important, but the question is, what kind of transparency? And I know that some important political transparency is very important. Economic transparency not. One of the things which really does the trick, and I did it with Michael Ehrman and Marcel Fretzer, a study when I was Duisenberg Fellow, also the same time as Volker Wieland at the ECB. We did a study about the consensus forecast data. You remember, they not only look to the average, the mean, but also the dispersion. Very interesting. When there's more uncertainty in the market, how is that triggered, and how can you diminish the dispersion of the forecast? And one of the tricks is political transparency, in particular inflation targeting. So then there is this about accountability. I will do it quickly, Mr. Chairman, because otherwise you get very nervous, and I don't want that on my conscience. The prioritization of the objectives is very important. So very clear-cut, what is the main objective of the central bank? What is prioritization? Disclosure of actual monetary, so transparency elements, very important, and the possibilities to sanction the central bank if they don't meet the objectives. It's also, in the inflation targeting framework, like the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the Walsh contracts, it's maybe easier, but then still you have a problem, Gerhard, because the principal can say, okay, you surpassed your target, that's okay with me, because it's very convenient. So in the principal agent setting, you still have a problem who sticks to the contracts, central bank or the principal, the Minister of Finance. But anyhow. Final dimension, sanctions, I already discussed that. Should you diminish if they don't agree, and I don't speak about the Federal Reserve building, but really sticking you to your targets. And then I will end, of course, with a quote by Otmar. And that's a very important quote. Giving up independence de facto might be seen as an option to preserve de jure independence. However, this could come at the expense of undermining the fundament of independence for the central bank. And I will finish with that. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sylvester. Thank you, Gerhard, for these really insightful presentations. We have a few minutes for questions, and I will open the floor for questions from the audience. Alain.
You raised an important point about the rule of law being a prerequisite for central bank. About the table you showed, how can you explain a high score for some countries like Poland, where the relationship to rule of law was time-barred, I would say?
That's an understatement. Depends on the government, but you're right. I think you should look to the central bank law, so you make the coding. But then, important is how important is that law? And first of all, there are central banks like Poland where, depending on the government, it's like also the judicial power, the Supreme Court. There were some problems. So. It's always a problem to take that into consideration. But what you normally do is you look to the product. The product, I wrote a paper in 2003, and that was looking to the indices, but also the importance of the rule of law in those countries. But the problem is that changing in some countries, like Poland, every government. Not in all countries. The People's Bank of China has no independence at all. So you can have a kind of Bundesbankgesetz, but it doesn't mean anything. So be subtle about it. So it's not, I would say, there is no clear-cut answer for that, to be honest. Yeah?
Other questions? Andy?
Well, thank you very much. It was a really fascinating panel. I'm skeptical that we're measuring things correctly. It's hard, right? These are really complex legal, political questions. Sorry.
The mic, is it working?
You have to turn it on? Yeah. There we go, better, okay. Okay, so thank you, really fascinating panel. The measurement problem is that these are difficult legal and political issues. So let me just point out two reasons why I think we really need to make more progress, and I appreciate the work that's already been done. So China's, an autocracy. Okay, there's no central bank independence. I think we agree on that. But they have a history of pretty low inflation, right? Unlike some other countries we can think of pretty quickly, Venezuela being an obvious one, have autocracy and really high inflation. There's something else that's more complicated, and I don't think the Barrow-Gordon kind of Kendall Prescott timing is really capturing those things very well at all. Okay. Another thing that was just glaring in the table you showed and fascinating to me, I don't know if you can put it back up again. Is it possible? I think it was table.
Which table?
The one that showed the different measures of CBI. You were comparing across the different studies, just so we can all see it. I think it was a fascinating table.
This one?
No, showing the data.
The correlation
Table
matrix?
one. No, one more back.
One more back.
There we go. Okay, so I'm going to come up here. Look, look down the whole. the list here, okay, Ramelli, which I think, you know, we can quibble with, okay, but very first column, okay, who is at the bottom? Australia, Japan, UK, okay? Japan is struggling for 2 decades or more with low inflation, trying to bring it up, okay? Australia, which until very recently was viewed as one of the most stable macroeconomies in the world from the 90s until 2019. And Britain, which I think, I'm going to be quiet now, but let me just finish with one sentence.
No, you should be quiet.
It's
important.
The Bank of England is a wonderful central bank. I think that I know Catherine Mann, and I know other people on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee,
Yeah.
and to say, oh, they're the least independent central bank and they should be banned from the planet.
I don't defend Romelli's index, eh? I don't defend that. But anyhow, and that's the reason, Andy, that's the reason why it's so important to look to all those indices and to compare that. So if I go now to this correlation matrix, you see there is a difference. And that has also with the coding. And these authors really try to be professional in the coding, but they have different criteria. They look to different, I would say, aspects. So that makes a difference. And that's the reason why I say it's important to look to all the indices. Heuver and Janke did also a comparison of all those indices. And they had the same correlation matrix, more or less, where there was not a perfect correlation between the indices. So you try to be exact as possible in terms of definition and coding. But what I want to say, there is also a tradition. And of course, the rule of law is important, that's one. But it's also important how broad do you formulate those indices. And I think, you know, the Kuckerman index was one of the most broad encompassing indices. And Romelli did some things as well. And you see that there is a difference, and we look to the whole picture. And then also some wisdom is sometimes needed. So maybe it's not so exact as some people think it is. And then the real problem is, you may be independent, what I said at the beginning, in terms of indices. But the real thing is the product of conservativeness and independence. Low inflation, what I explained to you this morning, in reaction to yesterday, that you should take into consideration not only the indices of independence, but the degree of conservativeness. And the product of conservativeness and independence is important for the equilibrium inflation rate in the long run. That's what I try to explain. And if you want to read the articles, there are also theoretical articles in the Lucas supply function, New Keynesian framework, you can look at all. But I try to explain there is a product, and it's very hard to determine the optimality of the product of conservativeness and independence. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
We have one last question by Mr. Lange.
Just a question of understanding, because when I wrote an article on that as a lawyer, I always wondered whether these economists had support by professional lawyers reading central bank statutes. Because sometimes you got the impression as a lawyer that maybe they interpreted something in there that we as lawyers would never have seen. So I think that's a problem with these indices as well, or you can convince me that there were lawyers trying to explain to the economists what really was behind these statutes, because it's very hard to read central bank statutes as well, even though you have rule of law and everything. It will depend on how you interpret the
Now a question to you, as a lawyer. Gesetz über die Deutsche Bundesbank states the Währungszusichere. Is that price stability or not?
Yeah, that's a question of interpretation. And
There it is.
if you want to have a general comparability around the world, this is exactly what you should study as well.
There we have it.
Okay, this was a good last word. Now we have it. I would like to thank the panelists for a really insightful, interesting discussion, and I think, yes, we should all give them a round of applause.